In a statement that sent shockwaves through the European defense community, Italian Defense Minister Guido Crosetto recently said, "NATO, as it is today, has no reason to exist." That's not something you expect to hear from a senior official of a founding NATO country. So what did he mean? Let's unpack it. Crosetto wasn't suggesting that NATO should be dismantled. But his words carry a warning. If NATO remains frozen in its old ways, shaped by Cold War mentalities and bureaucratic inertia, it will become irrelevant in the face of today's rapidly evolving threats. This is more than a political soundbite. It's a reflection of deep concerns spreading across Europe, concerns about how NATO must adapt or risk fading into strategic irrelevance. Because while NATO debates internal reforms and budget contributions, the world outside isn't waiting. In the East, Russia is rising from its post-Cold War ashes, not diplomatically, but militarily. And it's not just Ukraine anymore. The battlefield is expanding, and the stakes are global. Add to that a rising China, and an America slowly realizing it may not be able to face down two military giants on its own. And suddenly, Crosetto's warning sounds less like criticism and more like a wake-up call. Just a few years ago, many in Europe still believed Russia's military threat was contained. Then came 2014, then 2022, and now? Russia is not retreating, it's preparing. In fact, Moscow has announced the creation of a new Western military district, stationed ominously close to the Finnish border, now part of NATO territory after Finland's historic entry into the alliance. This isn't symbolic. This is practical escalation. After suffering losses in Ukraine, Russia isn't stepping back. It's retooling, recruiting, and spending deeply. The Kremlin is pumping billions into rebuilding an army more resilient, more experienced, and more aggressive. Thousands of new conscripts, high-tech weapon systems, updated doctrine, all built around one purpose: preparing for long-term conflict, not just in Ukraine, but potentially against NATO itself. Even Russian propaganda is no longer subtle. It's rehearsing scenarios of confrontation with the West. New missile systems are being stationed closer to Europe. Military drills simulate attacks on Baltic states and Poland. And let's not forget Kaliningrad, a heavily militarized Russian enclave wedged between NATO members. The message is clear. Russia sees NATO as an enemy, and it's preparing to act like it. So when Crosetto questions NATO's current form, he isn't rejecting NATO. He's saying, the old version isn't enough for this new world. Not when one of the largest armies on Earth is being rebuilt on Europe's doorstep with NATO directly in its crosshairs. Russia has long argued that NATO's eastward expansion represents a direct threat to its national security. Moscow claims that after the Cold War, Western powers had promised not to expand the alliance into Eastern Europe, a narrative the Kremlin repeats to justify its increasingly aggressive posture. The invasion of Ukraine in 2022 was framed by Russian officials as a defensive move against so-called NATO encroachment. But this story falls apart under scrutiny. No NATO country has ever threatened to attack Russia. NATO is a defensive alliance, not an offensive bloc. What's more, the nations that joined NATO in the East, Poland, the Baltics, Romania, and others, did so voluntarily. They sought NATO protection because of their own experiences with Russian aggression. To suggest that NATO is the aggressor flips reality on its head. And yet, despite Russia's narrative, no one in NATO is calling for a rollback of the alliance's borders. The idea that NATO should abandon Eastern Europe is not on the table, and never should be. By claiming victimhood, Russia attempts to mask its own imperial ambitions. While Russia builds in the West, another shadow looms in the East, China. The People's Liberation Army is undergoing the most significant military expansion in its modern history. Naval power, missile capabilities, space warfare, cyber dominance, all growing fast. And the target? Taiwan. Beijing has made it clear that it sees Taiwan as part of its territory. U.S. intelligence and defense analysts increasingly believe a confrontation is only a matter of time. If that happens and the U.S. is pulled into a war in the Indo-Pacific, can it also guarantee security in Europe at the same time? Here's where NATO comes in. Crosetto's criticism isn't about destroying the alliance. It's about preparing it for a world where America is stretched thinner than ever before. And if the U.S. can't be everywhere at once, Europe must step up. There's one more region, often overlooked, where the future of global power will be decided. It's not Ukraine, not Taiwan, and not the South China Sea. It's the Arctic. The race for control over the Arctic Circle is intensifying, and it's not just about frozen tundra. It's about oil, gas, rare earth minerals, new shipping lanes, and military positioning. As the ice melts, new sea routes like the Northern Sea Route are opening, These could shave thousands of kilometers off commercial and military transit between Europe and Asia. Russia knows this and is moving fast. Moscow is militarizing the Arctic at a stunning pace. It has reopened more than 50 Soviet-era bases, deployed advanced radar systems, S-400 missile systems, and positioned strategic bombers above the polar circle. Russia's powerful northern fleet now has a central role in Arctic dominance. Meanwhile, China, though not an Arctic country, calls itself a near-Arctic state and is investing in infrastructure, icebreakers, and scientific bases in the region. It's a slow, strategic creep northward. And here's the catch. NATO has no unified Arctic strategy. That's a problem, because 5 NATO members, the US, Canada, Norway, Denmark, Greenland, and Iceland, are Arctic states. Finland and Sweden's entry into NATO further increases its northern footprint. But a footprint isn't a strategy. To deter Russia and outpace China's influence, Europe and America must back each other in the Arctic, militarily and economically. This is no longer just about defending warm cities in Western Europe. It's about preparing for conflict in extreme, frozen frontiers. Corsetto's critique applies here too. If NATO cannot act swiftly and cohesively in a region as strategically vital as the Arctic, then the very credibility of the alliance is at risk. The ice may be melting, but the threats are solidifying. In 2025, a new flashpoint has shaken global security and exposed serious cracks in NATO's unity: the growing military conflict between Israel and Iran. As Israel escalates military strikes to cripple Iran's nuclear program, NATO's position is anything but united. In fact, it's deeply fragmented, revealing the diverging geopolitical interests of its major members. Turkey has been the most vocal, demanding that Israel halt its operations immediately. Ankara has criticized what it sees as disproportionate military actions and refused to support any NATO-wide move that could be perceived as aiding Israel. France and Germany have taken a similar diplomatic tone, urging Israel to de-escalate and calling for restraint. Their focus is on preventing a broader regional war, with concerns about refugee flows, economic instability, and energy security dominating their calculus. But across the Atlantic, the United States sees the conflict very differently. Washington actively supports Israel militarily, especially in operations aimed at ensuring Iran does not develop nuclear weapons. The U.S. views the threat from a nuclear-capable Iran as a global issue, not just a regional one, and has reportedly drawn up plans for potential joint missions with Israeli forces. Then, there's the United Kingdom, caught in the middle. London has publicly called for de-escalation, echoing the European position. But behind the scenes, it has signaled a willingness to support U.S.-led coalition actions against Iran if a red line is crossed, especially if evidence of Iranian nuclear weaponization emerges. The result? No unified NATO position on one of the most volatile conflicts of our time. While the conflict unfolds, NATO finds itself paralyzed by internal disagreement. There is no Article 5 trigger, no joint task force, no alliance-wide strategy. The alliance's silence speaks volumes. And this isn't just a political embarrassment, it's a strategic vulnerability. Because adversaries are watching. Iran, Russia, and even China are seeing firsthand that NATO's collective voice can be muted when its members disagree on core issues. This lack of cohesion reinforces Guido Corsetto's point. NATO cannot function effectively in a multipolar world if it cannot present a united front when new threats emerge, even when they fall outside traditional European theaters. If NATO cannot decide where it stands on conflicts that shape the global order, then what role will it play in the future? The Israel-Iran conflict is more than a regional war, it's a test of NATO's political relevance. To be fair, NATO isn't standing still. The alliance is undergoing its biggest transformation since the Cold War. After Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, many European nations finally woke up. Defense budgets were raised. Germany broke with decades of pacifism and launched a 100 billion euros military modernization plan. Poland now spends over 4% of its GDP on defense, more than any other NATO country, including the United States. NATO's rapid reaction forces in Europe are being expanded from 40,000 to over 300,000 troops. New military infrastructure is being built, supply chains fortified, and joint exercises are happening more frequently. So yes, NATO is changing. But the question is, fast enough for what? Because the threats are adapting faster. Russia isn't waiting for NATO's paperwork. China isn't waiting for another summit. Iran, North Korea, cyber militias, they're probing the West's defenses now. And here's the core issue. NATO's unity is not guaranteed. Different members have different threat perceptions. Southern Europe focuses on North Africa and migration. Eastern Europe fears Russia. The US wants help with China. Turkey blocks decisions for its own interests. And inside Europe, pro-Russian politicians are gaining ground, Hungary's Viktor Orbán being a key example. These political fractures slow down decision-making, weaken deterrence, and damage credibility. That's why we're seeing a rise in regional military alliances, partnerships forming within NATO to bypass gridlock. Examples: the Scandinavia-Baltic Pact, Sweden, Finland, Norway, Denmark, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania are conducting joint exercises and sharing intelligence more intensively than ever before. The Poland-Baltics-Ukraine axis is another emerging bloc. It's a defensive wall forming against Russian influence, driven by shared threat awareness and the urgency to act without delay. These groups are not undermining NATO, they're filling the gaps where NATO is too slow to respond. But this should be a warning. When members feel the alliance can't meet their needs quickly enough, they go around it. And when that happens too often, unity fractures. Corsetto was right again. NATO's problem isn't its existence, it's its inertia. If it doesn't speed up, it risks becoming a forum, not a shield. Let's be clear, NATO is not obsolete. It remains the most successful military alliance in human history. No NATO country has ever been invaded while under the alliance's umbrella. And that stability doesn't just benefit Europe, it benefits the United States too. A secure Europe means fewer American troops deployed overseas. It means reliable trade partners. It means a check on authoritarian regimes trying to divide the West. But to remain relevant, NATO must modernize. Corsetto's words weren't a condemnation, they were a challenge. So where does this leave us? Minister Corsetto was right to sound the alarm. NATO in its current structure is outdated, but that doesn't mean it's useless. It means it must evolve. We are entering a new age of confrontation, one that is global, hybrid, and multipolar. The threats are no longer just tanks crossing borders. They are cyber attacks, space warfare, AI-driven conflict, economic coercion, and proxy wars. Russia is watching, China is preparing, and Iran, North Korea, and others are observing how the West responds. Corsetto's message isn't to abandon NATO, it's to wake it up. Before it's too late, NATO is still the spine of Western security. But if it doesn't evolve now, it may not survive the tests to come. If you found this video insightful, you won't want to miss our upcoming episode. From Iran to Ukraine, is Trump changing his war strategy? Next time, we dive into Donald Trump's evolving stance on America's conflicts, from the nuclear standoff with Iran to the grinding war in Ukraine. Is the president preparing for a more aggressive posture? Or is this just politics as usual? Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss it. Hit the bell. Let us know your thoughts below. Do you think NATO could collapse in the near future? That was Global Tensions. Until next time, stay sharp, stay informed. Thank you for watching. If you found this video helpful, please like, subscribe, and share. Subscribe and step into the real world of geopolitics, no filters, no propaganda. Stay updated with deep dive geopolitical analysis and join our growing community for real discussions. Exclusive interviews with fighters from Ukraine and the International Legion are coming raw, unfiltered, and only here on Global Tensions.